Mr. Beamer here with another video. We're going to continue. We're in chapter 42, talking about the 1970s, and the quote is from Richard Nixon, talking about he was never a crook, and well, he was a crook. And the music, the intro music was from Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. It was called Ohio, and it had to do with the Kent State shootings of 1970, one of the tragic events in APUSH, and also regarding the Vietnam War. Economics is always a big theme in APUSH, and I think important to know that the economy really struggled in the 1970s. Okay, after the 50s and 60s, the booming economy, the 70s was one of the worst economies in American history, and so one of the biggest causes was the higher oil prices. Okay, oil prices went up dramatically in the 70s and led to inflation, which was also probably one of the biggest issues of the poor economy. And so the 70s economy, and it happened pretty much the entire 1970s, we had high inflation, high unemployment, and this idea is known as stagflation. Right here, it's kind of covered up, but stagflation is high inflation, high unemployment, one of the worst economic situations there is. And Nixon tried to do things, but he just could not really solve the high inflation. Next topic is the Vietnam War, and a key term in APUSH highlight this: Vietnamization. That was Nixon's policy. And his policy was to slowly withdraw American troops and allow the South Vietnamese to fight their own war. And that was also related to the Nixon Doctrine. Okay, a lot of presidents have doctrines. The Truman Doctrine, one of the most famous ones. The Nixon Doctrine is basically Vietnamization. Okay, we're going to honor our commitments against communism in the future, but the Asians, especially in South Vietnam, are going to have to fight their own war. Okay, many of the protesters hated Nixon, and these people were called the Doves, and they wanted the troops out immediately, but that did not happen until 1973. Nixon does try to appeal to this group out high. This is silent majority. That is the middle class, white America, and this is the people that Nixon said would help him. They were against the protesters, and they were his biggest supporters. Vietnam is the longest war in American history. It's the third most costliest war. And it was really a class war in many ways, because the least privileged, okay, poor people, minority groups, they're the ones that were drafted into the war. They could not get the exemptions that the richer people could get. So it was really a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. And many college students were able to get deferments and not go into the Vietnam War. Another bad event regarding Vietnam is the My Lai Massacre, 1968. This is when LBJ was still president. But basically, American soldiers massacred hundreds of women and children. They were ordered to do this. It's one of the saddest events, and this led to more people being against Vietnam. Also, Nixon widens the war in 1970 by attacks Cambodia. Cambodia, that's not in Vietnam, but it was a neighboring country. The Ho Chi Minh Trail went through Cambodia. Nixon widened the war and attacked Cambodia, causing more protests. One of the biggest results of Nixon bombing Cambodia was the Kent State University shootings in May of 1970. That relates to the intro song by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Ohio. And so when Nixon bombs or invades Cambodia, there were many protests around the country, and the most famous one, the saddest one, was at Kent State University in Ohio, and 4 college students were gunned down by the National Guard, and it was one of the saddest events. This is one of the famous images of the Kent State killings. This person is dead, is laying on the ground there, and one of his friends is looking over his body and has a face of like, why is this happening? So this led to more people disliking Vietnam and also Richard Nixon. Partially in response to all the protests, the government does reduce the number of people that were drafted into the war, so that's partly due to Nixon's Vietnamization. So less people were going into the Vietnam War by the early 1970s. The 26th Amendment was also passed, lowering the voting age to 18. If 18-year-olds can go fight in Vietnam, they also should be able to have the right to vote. Another key event, APUSH, is the Pentagon Papers, 1971. This is secret government information was leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. Okay, he had a role in the government, and he leaked this information to the New York Times. And basically, the Pentagon Papers showed that the United States government knew all along that Vietnam was not going to go well, and it tried to cover up a bunch of things about Vietnam, also talking about the North Vietnamese attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. And basically, this led to the American public realizing that the government has been lying about the Vietnam War, and this was one of the final straws of the Vietnam War, where Americans were so upset with the war. Right, Nixon had many flaws, but there's good and bad in everybody, and the good of Richard Nixon was his foreign policy with the Soviet Union and China, and this is called détente, okay, and we'll get to that in a second. I would know this guy, Dr. Henry Kissinger, okay, highlight this guy. He was Nixon's national security advisor and eventually also his Secretary of State. So he was in charge of American foreign policy during Nixon and also during Ford's administration after Nixon resigns. So Kissinger is given a lot of credit for helping relations improve, and of course so is Nixon. So what does Nixon do to make things better? He visits China in 1972. He opens up trade with China. He goes to Moscow, also in 1972, the Soviet Union. So this improving of relations between the communists and the United States is called détente. The definition of détente is the relaxation of tensions with China and Russia for the United States. And this actually helped also our relationship with both of these countries because we're nice to both countries. It was less likely that they would gang up on the United States and go to a war against us. Okay, here are some examples of détente. We gave grain to the Soviets, gave them food, and also we signed the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviets, limiting each nation to 2 clusters of defensive missiles. So this is just a symbol of the relaxation of tensions. Also, SALT was also signed. This is probably more important. I would highlight SALT 1, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Basically, it froze the number of long-range missiles for 5 years between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is an example of détente, and it's probably Nixon's greatest accomplishment is the détente with China and the Soviet Union. And so he has détente, and he also ends the Vietnam War. His foreign policy is pretty strong. The rest of his policies, maybe not as much. Now we're going to talk about the Supreme Court, and especially during the 1960s, this was basically the Warren Court, Earl Warren's court, and you need to know for APUSH is that the Supreme Court became more liberal in the 1960s, and here are some examples. Griswold v. Connecticut struck down a law banned contraceptives. It upheld the right of privacy for women. Gideon v. Wainwright said that all defendants were entitled to legal counsel, so that's people who are accused of crimes. Another, probably the most famous one is the Miranda case. It said that those and ensured the rights of the accused to remain silent as well. So the 60s Supreme Court decisions were very liberal, giving more rights to the people, more rights to criminals. So to highlight, the Supreme Court was quite liberal during the 1960s, the Warren Court. However, Nixon, when he takes over, he does appoint 4 conservative justices, so the Supreme Court does become more conservative into the 1970s. However, despite being more conservative, they were reluctant to undo the liberal rulings of the Warren Court, which upset Nixon. And the most famous decision of the Burger Court, Nixon, who appointed it as Chief Justice, was Roe v. Wade. It legalized abortion, and this upset many conservatives, and this law is still very controversial today. And especially in the 1980s, it really was one of the biggest divisive issues, abortion and affirmative action. Nixon on the home front. Now, he was a conservative Republican. However, some of his early decisions were quite liberal. So an example is he expanded the food stamps and Medicaid that were created by LBJ before him. That's a liberal idea. And also the welfare programs as well to help the poor. The poverty rate thus was reduced to 11% in 1973. So Nixon did do some for the poor, especially early in his presidency. In addition, the Philadelphia Plan, it was a more liberal idea, required construction unions working on federal contracts to make goals and timetables for hiring African Americans. So it was designed to help African Americans. But this initial, more liberal ideas does change for Nixon, change over time as we get to the 1972 election. More rather liberal ideas for Nixon was creating the EPA, highlight the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, which is still around today. And so this was the beginning of the environmental movement, and this was caused, must know in APUSH, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Highlight this book by this author really got the environmental movement going. It showed the harmful effects of pesticides, and it did lead to laws passed to help the environment. Also, Earth Day was created in 1970. So all these things happened under Nixon, who was a conservative Republican, but he did have some liberal tendencies, especially early in his presidency. We talked about the economy was struggling in the 70s, especially the high inflation. So in 1971, to lessen the high inflation, is he imposed a 90-day wage and price freeze. So if prices don't go up, inflation is not going to be as big of a problem. It was not very successful. The next thing I want to highlight is the Southern strategy. I would highlight this. And so Nixon wanted to get reelected, like all presidents do in the 1972 election. And so he decides that he's going to appeal to white voters. And so he is not going to promote the civil rights like he initially did in 1969. And he is openly opposing school busing to achieve racial balance. So the Southern strategy is to get Southern whites to vote Republican, so he does not help with the civil rights movement. So this has changed over time. He changed the strategy to appeal to white Southerners especially, because he wanted to win the 1972 election, and he does win in a landslide. However, this election is also the turning point for Nixon because of an event called Watergate. All right, I combined the next two sections because they're relatively short. First one is about the election of 1972, and so Nixon goes against Democrat George McGovern. Don't need to know him, but Nixon does win in a landslide, especially in the Electoral College. He also gained more support right before the election when he announces, or his Secretary of State announces, Henry Kissinger, that there's peace at hand in Vietnam. And so in June of 1972, though, this event is when the Watergate break-in occurs, and this is not really known until, given much thought, until after the election, but this is the event that's going to really ruin him. And the thing is, Nixon did not need his supporters to break into the Democratic headquarters at Watergate because he clearly was going to win by a landslide in the first place. All right, the next section is bombing North Vietnam to the peace table. So after winning the election, Nixon does try to force North Vietnam to end the crisis in Vietnam, and so he bombs them for 2 weeks, and many people are upset about it. But eventually, North Vietnam does agree to the ceasefire in January 1973, so this is the symbol that the Vietnam War is over. In January of 1973, Richard Nixon ends the Vietnam War, and it also stated that the South Vietnamese would eventually have to have free elections. Free elections never really are going to happen. And then 2 years later, North Vietnam is going to invade South Vietnam and take it over. We'll get to that later. Next section is about Watergate. The Watergate woes of Richard Nixon. And so this is going to be what brings Nixon down and makes him the only president ever to resign. So it happens before the election of 1972. It's in June. And there's a burglary inside the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate building. Watergate was a building in Washington, D.C., and the burglars are working for an organization called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. I would highlight this group. And these people got caught. They were arrested. Now, Nixon denied knowledge of the break-in, and he probably did not order the break-in, but eventually he does order the cover-up, and that's what's going to cause him to really eventually resign. So in 73, 74, after the election, a year after the election, the Senate decides to conduct hearings to investigate Watergate. Nixon was accused of covering up the break-in, and he does. And this is why Nixon eventually has to resign, because he tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. And this is a famous poster showing that all these people were apprehended for the Watergate break-in except for one, and there he is, Richard Nixon. But eventually he will get caught, and it will have to resign in August of 1974. So what helps bring Nixon down? It is the audio tapes, the great tape controversy. And so it was found that Nixon audio taped all of his phone conversations, part of his White House bugging equipment. He originally denied any knowledge of Watergate, but now they could be checked. They could check the audio tapes to see if he lied about it and knew anything about the cover-up, and he did. And all this was going on. His vice president, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew. Spiro is my hero. Maybe not. He was forced to resign after being found guilty of taking bribes. So the vice president left. He resigned because he took bribes, and so now who's going to replace Spiro Agnew? Fire up Gerald R. Ford, but we call him Our Ford. He's from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was appointed Nixon's vice president by Richard Nixon. He was confirmed by the Congress. So Gerald R. Ford is now the new vice president for Richard Nixon. So after Gerald Ford takes over as VP, there's more bad news for Nixon. He fires a man named Archibald Cox, and basically he was the special prosecutor in charge of the Watergate investigation. Nixon fires this guy in charge of the investigation because he wanted Nixon's tapes, and Nixon refused to give up his audio tapes and other documents. And so Nixon, that same night, fires a few other people that wanted the tapes. And so this is called the Saturday Night Massacre. This is in October of 1973. It's a year after the election, a year before Nixon really resigned. But this is a turning point in the Watergate scandal, and people saw this like, this guy must be guilty. And so the Saturday Night Massacre is the beginning of the end for Nixon. He resigns 9 months later. Last slide for this video. So Nixon continued aerial battering of Cambodia. This comes under fire. He was ordered secret bombings of Cambodia. This is even after the ceasefire with Vietnam in January of 1973. He continued these bombings of the communist forces to help the right-leaning Cambodian government as well. So this bombings gets America even more upset with Nixon, and this and the entire Vietnam War, and also the LBJ, Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, helps Congress pass the War Powers Act. I would highlight this, very important. The War Powers Act of 1973 said the president has to report to Congress within 48 hours, within 2 days of deploying troops. Also, the president can only send in troops for up to 60 days without the approval of Congress. And so this is passed. It's an important law, and it tries to limit the power of the president. And this was done partly because of Nixon's bombings of Cambodia and because of LBJ's blank check escalating the Vietnam War.